Focus is the entry point for all meaningful learning because it directly controls whether your brain even decides to change. When you try to learn something new, what you're really doing is asking your nervous system to rewire itself, to strengthen certain connections between neurons while weakening others. That process, known as neuroplasticity, doesn't just happen because you showed up or spent time with the material. It only happens when your level of attention crosses a certain threshold. When attention is shallow or divided, the brain treats the experience as low priority. This is why multitasking is so damaging to learning. If you're checking your phone, listening to music with lyrics, or switching between tasks, your brain is constantly resetting its focus. Each time you shift attention, there's a cognitive cost, and that cost prevents the deep encoding required for skill acquisition. In practical terms, you might feel like you're spending time learning, but very little of that time is actually translating into lasting change. Deep focus, on the other hand, creates a very different internal state. It increases the release of specific neurochemicals like acetylcholine and norepinephrine, which sharpen neural activity and highlight the circuits that need to be strengthened. This is your brain's way of saying, "This matters. Save this." Without that chemical signal, information tends to remain temporary and fades quickly. There's also a sensory component to focus that often gets overlooked. When you're truly concentrated, your perception narrows. You become less aware of distractions, and your mind locks onto the task at hand. This narrowing isn't a limitation, it's a feature. It allows your brain to allocate more resources to a single stream of information, which increases both the speed and accuracy of learning. One useful way to think about focus is as a spotlight. Wherever you point it, your brain invests energy into building and refining circuits related to that activity. But the spotlight can only illuminate one area clearly at a time. If you keep moving it around, nothing gets enough exposure to develop properly. Holding that spotlight steady, even when it feels uncomfortable or mentally demanding, is what leads to progress. There's also a training effect involved. Focus itself is a skill that improves with repetition. The more often you practice sustained attention, the easier it becomes to enter that state. Early on, it might only last a few minutes before your mind drifts. That's normal. What matters is bringing your attention back again and again. Each return strengthens your ability to stay engaged for longer periods. Over time, this creates a compounding effect. As your focus improves, your learning sessions become more efficient, which leads to faster progress. That progress then reinforces your motivation, making it easier to focus again in the future. Learning speeds up dramatically when you allow yourself to make mistakes and then actively correct them, because the brain is designed to treat errors as high-value signals for change. When you attempt a skill and get something wrong, your nervous system doesn't just register failure. It detects a mismatch between what you intended to do and what actually happened. That gap is what drives neuroplasticity. Inside the brain, this process involves circuits that compare prediction and outcome. You generate an internal expectation of how something should go. And when reality doesn't match that expectation, specific neurons fire more strongly. This increase in activity flags the moment as important. It tells your brain something here needs adjustment. Without that signal, the system assumes everything is working fine and sees no reason to update or improve. This is why practicing only what you already know how to do well leads to very slow progress. If you stay in a comfort zone where errors are rare, your brain receives very little information about what needs to change. It becomes efficient at maintaining current performance, but not at expanding capability. Real growth happens when you deliberately push into a range where mistakes are frequent enough to generate feedback, but not so overwhelming that you can't recover or understand what went wrong. There's also a timing component that matters. The closer the correction is to the mistake, the more effective the learning. When you recognize an error and adjust immediately, the brain can link the two events together. That connection strengthens the updated pattern and makes it more likely to occur correctly the next time. If too much time passes, that link weakens, and the opportunity for rapid learning is reduced. Emotion plays a role here as well. Many people experience frustration or discouragement when they make mistakes, which can actually interfere with the learning process. When the emotional response is too negative, it can shut down focus and reduce the brain's ability to process feedback. A more useful approach is to treat errors as neutral data, as information about what to refine rather than as a reflection of ability. This keeps the system engaged and open to adjustment. Another important aspect is specificity. Not all mistakes are equally useful. Vague or repeated errors without understanding don't help much. What accelerates learning is identifying exactly what went wrong and making a targeted correction. This sharpens the feedback loop and allows the brain to update the precise circuits involved rather than making broad, inefficient changes. Over time, this cycle of attempt, error, and correction becomes more efficient. Your brain starts to anticipate potential mistakes before they happen and adjusts proactively. This is when performance begins to feel smoother and more controlled. Not because errors have disappeared, but repetition is essential for learning. But the way repetition is structured determines whether it actually strengthens your brain or just creates the illusion of progress. When you repeat something over and over in a single session, it can feel productive because performance improves in the moment. You start recalling information faster or executing a skill more smoothly. But much of that improvement is temporary. It's driven by short-term activation in neural circuits, not lasting structural change. What leads to durable learning is spacing those repetitions over time. When you step away from a skill and then return to it later, your brain is forced to reconstruct what it did before. That reconstruction process is effortful, and that effort is exactly what strengthens the underlying neural connections. Instead of simply replaying a fresh memory, you're rebuilding it, which makes it more stable and easier to access in the future. This is tied to something called retrieval difficulty. When recalling or performing a skill feels slightly challenging, your brain engages more deeply with the material. That increased engagement enhances plasticity. If something feels too easy, it usually means the circuits are already active and don't need much reinforcement. If it feels impossible, the system can't generate a clear signal for improvement. The optimal zone is where recall or performance requires effort but is still achievable. Spacing also introduces a beneficial level of forgetting. That might sound counterintuitive, but forgetting is not a failure of learning. It's part of the process. When you forget slightly and then successfully retrieve the information, the brain treats that as a high-value event. It strengthens the memory more than it would if the information had remained easily accessible the entire time. In a sense, each cycle of partial forgetting and effortful recall acts like a workout for your neural circuits. There's also a timing element that can be adjusted depending on the skill. Early in the learning process, shorter gaps between sessions can be helpful to establish a basic foundation. As you improve, increasing the spacing between sessions challenges your ability to retain and retrieve the skill under less ideal conditions. This progression keeps the brain adapting instead of plateauing. Another advantage of spaced repetition is that it reduces mental fatigue. Long, continuous sessions often lead to diminishing returns because attention drops and errors become less informative. Shorter, focused sessions allow you to maintain high-quality effort, which is far more important than total time spent. It's not about how long you practice, but how effectively your brain is engaged during that practice. Over time, spacing creates stronger and more flexible learning. Skills become easier to access in different contexts, not just the one in which they were practiced. That flexibility is a key marker of real mastery, and it emerges not from intensity alone, but from the rhythm of returning to the skill again and again under slightly varied condition. Rest is not a break from learning. It is a critical phase of learning where the brain continues the work you started during practice. When you engage intensely with a skill, you activate specific neural circuits. But at that point, those circuits are still fragile. They've been stimulated, but they haven't yet been stabilized or fully integrated. That stabilization happens during periods of rest and, most importantly, during sleep. During sleep, especially in deeper stages and during REM, the brain replays patterns of activity that occurred while you were practicing. This replay is not random. It's a highly structured process where the brain strengthens the connections that were used and prunes away those that were irrelevant or inefficient. In a sense, your brain is rehearsing the skill without you consciously doing anything. This is why people often notice improvement after a good night of sleep, even if they struggled during the previous day's practice. There's also a chemical environment during sleep that supports this process. Certain neuromodulators shift in ways that favor consolidation over input. While you're awake, your brain is constantly taking in new information and responding to stimuli. During sleep, that input is reduced and the brain can focus on organizing and embedding what it has already experienced. Without that shift, the learning remains unstable and more easily lost. Even short periods of rest while you're awake can play a role. Moments where you step away from active practice, closing your eyes, sitting quietly, or simply disengaging from stimulation, allow the brain to process recent activity. These brief pauses can enhance retention by giving neural circuits a chance to reset and consolidate at a smaller scale. Constantly pushing without breaks can overload the system and reduce the quality of learning. Sleep deprivation has a particularly strong negative effect on this entire process. When you don't get enough sleep, the brain's ability to consolidate new information is significantly impaired. You might still be able to perform a skill in the short term, but the long-term retention and improvement are compromised. In some cases, lack of sleep can even interfere with the formation of accurate memories, leading to inconsistent or degraded performance later on. There's also an interaction between the intensity of practice and the need for rest. The more focused and effortful your learning session is, the more your brain requires recovery to lock in those changes. High-quality learning creates a kind of demand for sleep because the brain has more to process and refine. Ignoring that need limits how much of the practice actually translates into progress. Over time, the pattern becomes clear. Practice initiates change, but rest completes it. Without adequate recovery, learning remains incomplete, no matter how much effort you put in during active training. Dopamine plays a central role in how quickly and effectively you learn, but not in the way most people assume. It's often associated purely with pleasure or reward, but its more important function is in motivation, attention, and reinforcing behaviors that the brain should repeat. In the context of learning, dopamine acts like a signal that tells your nervous system what is worth pursuing and what should be strengthened. When you engage in a task and experience a sense of progress or reward, dopamine is released. That release increases the likelihood that you'll return to the same behavior and stay engaged with it. But the critical factor is what your brain associates that dopamine with. If the release is tied only to outcomes, like getting a correct answer, winning, or achieving a goal, your motivation becomes dependent on success. This creates a fragile system where effort drops whenever results are slow or inconsistent. A more effective approach is to link dopamine to the process itself, especially the act of trying, adjusting, and persisting through difficulty. When you learn to experience effort as rewarding, your brain starts to reinforce the behaviors that actually lead to improvement. This includes focusing deeply, making mistakes, and refining your approach. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where the very activities that drive learning also become intrinsically motivating. There's also an anticipatory component to dopamine. It doesn't just respond after a reward, it rises in expectation of one. This anticipation can be used to your advantage. When you set clear, achievable targets within a learning session, your brain begins to generate motivation in advance, which helps you stay engaged. Importantly, these targets don't have to be major milestones. Small markers of progress, like understanding a concept more clearly or executing a movement more smoothly, can trigger this system. However, the dopamine system is sensitive to overstimulation. Constant exposure to highly rewarding activities, such as social media, fast-paced entertainment, or frequent novelty, can raise the threshold for what feels engaging. This makes slower, effortful tasks like learning a new skill feel less appealing by comparison. In that state, it becomes harder to generate the motivation needed for deep work. Reducing excessive stimulation can help recalibrate the system, making it easier to focus and find satisfaction in effort. Another important aspect is consistency. Dopamine reinforces patterns that occur repeatedly. When you show up regularly and engage with a skill, even in small amounts, you train your brain to expect and prepare for that activity. This expectation increases readiness and reduces resistance over time. Skipping sessions or being inconsistent disrupts that pattern and weakens the motivational loop. As this process continues, effort begins to feel less like a struggle and more like a natural part of the experience. The brain starts to associate challenge with reward, and that shift dramatically increases both the speed and sustainability of learning. One of the most powerful ways to accelerate learning is to actively express or teach what you're trying to understand, because it forces your brain to move beyond recognition and into true comprehension. When you first encounter new information, it often feels familiar quickly. You might read something, watch a lesson, or observe a demonstration and think you understand it. But that sense of understanding is often shallow. It's based on recognition, not the ability to generate or apply the knowledge independently. The moment you try to explain that same concept in your own words, something different happens. Your brain can no longer rely on the original source. It has to reconstruct the idea from scratch, organize it logically, and translate it into a clear form. This process is much more demanding, and that demand is what drives deeper learning. It exposes whether the information is actually encoded in a usable way or just loosely stored. When you attempt to teach, gaps in your understanding become immediately obvious. You might struggle to connect ideas, forget key steps, or realize that certain parts don't make sense to you. These gaps are extremely valuable because they point directly to what needs more attention. Instead of reviewing everything again, you can focus specifically on the weak points, which makes your learning more efficient. There's also a structural benefit to explaining concepts. In order to teach something, you have to simplify it. This doesn't mean removing important details, but rather organizing them in a way that is clear and coherent. That act of simplification forces your brain to identify the core principles and relationships within the material. As a result, your understanding becomes more flexible and easier to apply in different contexts. Verbalizing information, even when you're alone, has measurable effects on retention. Speaking engages additional neural pathways compared to silent thinking. It activates motor systems, auditory processing, and language networks all at once. This multi-system involvement strengthens the memory trace and makes recall more reliable later on. Writing can have a similar effect, especially when you're generating explanations rather than copying notes. Another important aspect is that teaching creates a form of retrieval practice. Instead of passively reviewing material, you're actively pulling it out of memory. This retrieval strengthens the connections associated with that knowledge and makes it easier to access in the future. The more often you practice retrieving and explaining, the more stable and durable those connections become. Over time, this habit transforms how you learn. You shift from consuming information to actively working with it. Each time you explain, you refine your understanding, making it clearer, more organized, and more accessible. The knowledge becomes something you can use, adapt, and build upon, rather than something you simply recognize when you see it again. As you continue this process, something important begins to shift. You're no longer just absorbing information, you're actively shaping it into a form your brain can use under real conditions. That shift is what turns short-term understanding into long-term skill. When you consistently express, explain, and test what you know, you build a system where learning feeds on itself, becoming faster, clearer, and more reliable over time.